In the centennial birth year of Blanche and Raymond, I've asked people to write stories. This one from Jim Rhoda, Nephew. This may not be what you're looking for, but it's difficult for me to separate Blanche from Raymond from Ray. They were just the Ripleys, and my rambling collections lump everyone together. The Ripleys. Aunt Blanche was a favorite aunt. She and Ma always got along great, and I remember that she'd come out regularly on Sunday mornings after delivering Ray, later Ray and Teresa, to Catholic Catechism in Chenal. They would work together on things like shelling garden peas for canning and chat, and as a small boy, I'd often eavesdrop. Blanche had a very high-pitched voice, almost shrill, and it didn't lack for volume. The thing that I remember most is that I never heard a cross word from her, particularly toward Mom, who was equally fond of her. Blanche always seemed cheerful, and it was enjoyable to be around her. Enthusiasm, unselfishness, and unpretentiousness were traits that she had in abundance. My memories of Uncle Raymond were likewise favorable, but because he was a farmer, always busy in the fields, I had less contact with him. He was more reserved and a typical hard-working farmer with an industrial-grade farmer's tan. His neck and arms were a deep shade of brown. Suntans were healthy back in those days. But when he'd stripped down to his undershirt to clean up for a meal, his upper arms and chest were lily white by contrast, much like Dad's. My dad seemed to enjoy Raymond's company as much as his own brothers, maybe more so. He always called Raymond skinny, which baffled me a lot when I was young and wondered if my dad had a vision problem. Raymond may not have qualified as fat, but certainly was toward the stout side, and definitely not skinny like I was. I found out later that Raymond had a brother who was also stout but taller. Dad referred to him as Tiny. We seemed to get together with the Ripleys frequently for Sunday family dinners. The men would sit together in the living room while the women were in the kitchen preparing the meal. Although the men seemed to enjoy each other's company, they talked little to each other, then occasionally about farming. It wasn't unusual for one to doze off while the other was talking. After all, it was Sunday, and farmers were expected to rest. Not the same for the women in the kitchen, however. In addition to preparing a lot of food together, there was always a lot of activity and a lively level of merry chatter, with Blanche's high-pitched voice always standing out. As a small boy, I preferred to hang around the kitchen than the living room before meals. There was more action. One topic that always came up during the Sunday meals together was planning the joint trip up to Brookfield Zoo, usually raised by Blanche. That trip was discussed more than any other non-event in my childhood. The reality was that we had a herd of dairy cows that had to be milked every night and morning, and considering the 2-hour travel time each direction, plus preparation time, we would have had about 2 hours to visit the zoo. In addition, there is a practical limit how far you can transport 6 kids in the back seat of a 1936 Ford, even without today's space shuttle car seat requirements for children under 50 pounds. That trip never happened, and to this day, I have never been to Brookfield Zoo, although I think that the Ripleys later took some of my younger siblings. Some of my fondest memories were of visits to the Ripleys without my parents, and a special treat was to stay overnight there with older cousin Ray, a virtual god in my eyes. I won't recycle the story of our World War II civil defense plans against the pending Japanese invasion of Okoye that I submitted for an essay on Don and our German cousins, but the war was a frequent topic of our imagination at play during those war years. Ray was quite an authority on the war and had an enviable selection of military toys, guns, etc., including a soldier's uniform. I vividly remember he had an ocean liner with a separate top and a target on the side and a torpedo boat that would shoot a wooden peg if you preset the spring in the ocean liner, an embedded mousetrap, and were able to hit the target with the torpedo. The spring would release and knock the whole top off the liner. What great fun to blow up a ship. Ray was also quite knowledgeable on all the popular cowboys at the time: Lone Ranger, Tom Mix, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, and Red Ryder, with an array of cowboy guns and even a pair of chaps. He also had a large stack of comic books, which were prohibited at our house. Dad may have banned comic books at home on moral grounds, but it's possible that economics were also a factor. Janine and I used to feast on Ray's stack of comic books whenever we had the opportunity. Another advantage of staying with the Ripleys is they lived directly across the hard road, meaning Route 66, from the village of Ocoya. That doesn't sound like much of an adventure today, but being raised in relative isolation on the farm, the opportunity to go across the hard road to the Ocoya skyscraper and buy a Coke for a nickel was living in luxury. I remember doing that once after I was specifically told by Dad not to cross the hard road. He later found out, and I vividly remember receiving a generous dose of corporal punishment, one of many, for that indiscretion. I also remember once when Ray took me inside the old abandoned railroad depot that was adjacent to the Ocoya elevator. I was shocked and embarrassed when I started to read the obscene graffiti on the walls. But the redeeming part that struck me, I was impressed with the perfect handwriting form that reflected excellent execution of the Palmer method of handwriting. Mrs. Morris, my teacher, would have been pleased except for the choice of words used. Route 66 was an exciting part of the Ripley visit experience. During the war, we would often watch in reverence as a procession of Army vehicles would travel by in convoy, often stretching for 2 or 3 miles with more than 100 vehicles. Ray would lead us in cheering to them because we knew that they were on their way to beat the Japs. Route 66 also provided a customer base for Blanche's egg business. She had a small hand-painted sign at the edge of the driveway that said, "Eggs," concisely worded advertising. City people, we thought, would stop off the highway and buy a dozen eggs frequently while we were there, and Blanche would welcome not only their business but also their company. Anyone who thought they were going to make a quick purchase and be on their way was mistaken. I never heard a complaint, not once. This is to be continued in part 2.